Biozone. So, I first stumbled upon this game during a Steam sale and was digging through the Konami back catalog. And at the very end of the discount list, I found this little 99-cent treasure called Biozone. And wow, those reviews, mostly negative and a pretty small number of them overall, considering it appears to have released in 2010.
This game is not worth your time. Subpar, awful, ugly, barely playable, frame rate is terrible, controls are stiff and clunky. I got it for free and still want a refund.
Ugh, ouch. But here's what pushed me into dropping $1 on this.
This game is just too Amiga for scrubs.
Boom! I'm sold. So I installed Biozone, fired up a stream, and truly had a blast in my first playthrough. At first glance, it's a pretty straightforward and generic-looking run-and-gun game. You can run, jump, shoot, roll, push crates, throw grenades, get gun power-ups, battle lots of mutant frog-legged dudes and barfing Sasquatch things, ride elevators, fly around with a jetpack, and just generally kick ass and blow shit up. There's even a bit of story and dialogue, giving this game a bit more lore and character than what you usually find in this genre. I thought it added a nice B-movie flavor in your mission to stop the bioterrorist Dr. Membranous. So to be fair, I think a few things right off the bat can be a bit of a turnoff, which would explain the swath of bad reviews, some with a minuscule amount of playtime. Like, they might have spent more time publicly denouncing Biozone than actually playing it. The controls and physics are a bit quirky, to say the least. Your shooting can be easily interrupted, you have to grab and climb some ledges with questionable collision detection, and jumping around can get kinda wild once you start taking damage. But like any connoisseur of jank, you learn to power through it and adapt, and I was soon getting used to the controls and feeling like Biozone could be a pretty fun speedrun. You can clip through some closed doors, launch yourself across the screen with acid puddles and grenades, roll around for days, and eventually find that fine balance of damage boosting and health meter management as you route your way to the nearest medkit and fling yourself to victory. I'll also mention, you don't have to speedrun this to enjoy it if that's not your thing. You can take your time dispatching every brain-dead enemy, administering antidotes to fallen soldiers, and the game does keep tally of your completion on these things. And the game is a pretty decent length. You've got 15 levels total that will probably take you about 2 or 3 hours your first time, plus you get unlimited continues and the ability to replay any previous stage you've finished before. I'd say any fan of 16-bit B-tier run-and-gun action will probably feel right at home here, and you'll have a great time if you can laugh at yourself randomly exploding instead of getting frustrated. By now you may be wondering, how did Konami of all companies end up putting their name on this? That's a bit of a mystery to me still, but I did briefly look into the developers of Biozone, G5 Entertainment, which appears to be founded in 2001 and has grown into what looks like a pretty successful company, pumping out very generic-looking casual mobile games. In fact, Biozone seems to have a Java version, and I was able to find some interesting footage, but not much other info on this. It's certainly more zoomed in and slower, but the core of the game seems to be about the same. It's hard to say whether the PC or mobile version came out first though, and G5's current site has zero mentions of Biozone at all. So the Konami connection is somewhat unsolved for now, but I'm personally thankful for that connection, as I may not have found this little gem otherwise. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and give Biozone a chance sometime. I'd love to know what you think, and if you have any other quality jank suggestions, go ahead and drop some in the comments, or come on by the Twitch stream sometime and hang out. Until next time, thanks for watching. What kind of magic spell? Oh, hey! Today we're looking at Labyrinth, Mao no Meikyu, based on the 1986 cult classic film by Jim Henson. Some other computer adventure games based on Labyrinth were also released for the PC-88, MSX2, Apple IIe, and Commodore 64. But here we're looking at the Famicom version, a unique top-down action-adventure published by Tokuma Shoten in 1987 and developed by Atlas, one of their earliest releases. This version was never officially released outside of Japan, but luckily a really well-done translation patch exists, so we can better enjoy this brain-bending experience. Following along the movie's plot, you play as Sarah in a quest to rescue your baby brother Toby from Jareth the Goblin King, who gives you 13 hours to do so, with a timer that also acts as a kind of health meter. With very heavy gauntlet vibes, you have to track down the 12 pieces of the key to the Goblin City and eventually make your way into Jareth's castle. Right off the bat, our worm friend tells us not to take anything for granted, as you'll soon find the Labyrinth messing with your head with some crazy screen wrapping stuff and other disorienting trickery. Add a steady flow of enemies that will stun lock you and reduce your ticking time even further, and you'll quickly see that a challenging quest lies ahead.
Oh, man.
Luckily, you run into a few friends along the way. That worm will update you on what items you still need from a level, along with selling you some helpful stuff. The wise man will drop some not-so-subtle hints on where to head next, along with trading offensive and defensive upgrades for coins found throughout the game. And you can also collect hearts to eventually be able to summon your pals Hoggle, Ludo, and Didymus. But man, Hoggle has seen better days. Despite this, you'll still need some strong resolve to push through the game's high difficulty curve, as you're immediately tossed into an ocean of confusion and unforgiving combat with one single life, no continues. Pepper in some random Jareth appearances where he pops up like Jason Voorhees, and be prepared for some anxious moments and inevitable heartbreak as you learn the ins and outs of the maze and begin to memorize how to progress without wasting too much of your precious 13 hours. At first, I was pretty nervous to try and get through this without any hints or guides, but with patience, you can definitely start getting more efficient with fending off enemies and remembering how to get all the keys. By the end, I had a lot of fun and felt very satisfied when I finally rescued Toby. As a big fan of Henson's work in general, I really appreciated all the attention to detail in including so many things from the movie. Locations like the Bog of Eternal Stench, and legit chiptune renditions of the film's music. And of course, the creepy-ass fire gang shows up. And while it was a cool idea to include these three as your companions, I was a little bummed out at how unnecessary they ended up being, and often more of a hindrance. He's gonna screw me over. Hoggle. Maybe there are some tricks to using them effectively, but more often than not, they would be slowing me down or just disappearing instantly anyway. So this was a pretty good game for 1987, and I had to wonder why it never came out in the West. This was news to me, but Labyrinth was not as successful at the time of its release as I thought it was. It didn't recover its budget in the box office, and was generally critically panned. It was definitely reevaluated more positively and started garnering a cult following several years after Jim Henson's passing in 1990, but by that point this game wouldn't look so hot sitting next to other top-down action-adventure games like Crystalis or Star Tropics. Luckily, Labyrinth had enough overseas success in Japan that Tokuma Shoten went ahead and published this unique version that aimed to stay a bit more faithful to the source material than its home PC counterparts. Otherwise, I'm curious to hear your thoughts if you've already tried Labyrinth, or let me know if you decide to give it a go. As always, thanks for watching. So in my recent journey along the pathless path of self-discovery and productivity research, I am very excited to present to you a brand new framework I have developed for the ultimate life hack in goal setting: SWAMP goals. You've probably heard of SMART goals: specific, measurable, blah blah blah. SWAMP goals are what you need to get your priorities straight and turn your life around. So there you have it. If you haven't already clicked off of this video to immediately implement this framework into your life, you might have a few more questions about the true essence of Swamp Thing. And luckily I'm here to help with a quick look into what may possibly be the paramount example of what's possible with Swamp goals: Swamp Thing on the NES. Denounced by many, but after wiping away some of the toxic waste, I believe this to be a misunderstood classic. Swamp Thing came out fairly late in the life cycle of the NES, December of 1992, published by THQ and developed by Imagineering, part of a merchandise marketing push following the very short-lived animated series in 1991, which only ended up with a run of 5 episodes. The game's intro sets up the somewhat scorching origin story of Alec Holland, and we are quickly dumped into the chaotic and absolutely vicious, trash-filled bayou as Swamp Thing. You may quickly see, hear, and feel some similarities to Bart vs. the Space Mutants, if you've played that before, as Swamp Thing resourcefully borrows the same game engine and many sound effects from past Imagineering classics. Shout out to the meowing snake. But one of the most important pieces of knowledge you will need on your Swamp Goal journey is the fact that run and jump are the same button. If you lack the determination to succeed in this game, this quirk is probably an immediate turnoff. But I would argue that learning to adapt to this unique control situation is an important life skill, as utilizing whatever tools you have at hand will get you compounding results beyond your wildest imagination. So if you can get ahead of 99% of people by actually finishing level 1, you're on a road to surefire success as you work your way through a nice variety of levels with some precise platforming, hidden areas housing extra health and additional lives, and even some creative moments where you become one with various types of plant life. I do wish there were more implementations of this, but they're a fun addition. You'll also face off with a few bosses, Demo, Weed Killer, and Skin Man, until your eventual final showdown with Anton Arcane himself. Overall, I really like the gritty but very cartoony feel to everything, and the gameplay actually starts feeling pretty great once you get the hang of things. I'm also drawn to the raw but charming soundtrack by Mark Van Heck, who also scored many other Imagineering games around that time. The music getting cut off by jump sound effects is a bit unfortunate, but luckily there's no time limit, so you're basically free to find a nice spot to twerk like no one is watching. I will say that learning the speedrun was probably helpful for accelerating my skill growth and increasing my appreciation for the game, and a sub 15 time remains one of my current Swamp goals in life. But the most important life lesson takeaway here is how to have fun with what you have. Obviously Swamp Thing isn't the most polished product, but underneath a bit of sludge and muck is a truly rewarding and challenging adventure if you're willing to put in a bit of extra effort. I'm sure you have other things going on out there in the real world, but I propose that if you can add a proper Swamp goal to your to-do list and follow through, your life will never smell the same again. Xenotilt is out! The much anticipated sequel to Demon's Tilt has just been released into early access, and man, it is wild. If you missed out on Demon's Tilt, it's a great video pinball game that came out in 2019 that was heavily inspired by the Crush pinball series of games from the 90s, with a smattering of bullet hell chaos thrown into the mix. Xenotilt continues this vibe with a similar 3-tiered table layout, but with more of a cyberpunk and mechanical aesthetic to everything. More importantly, they really cranked up the intensity this time around. In my first few hours of play, everything feels more frantic and fast-paced, and somehow they even managed to dial up the on-screen chaos with loads of neon projectiles and particles, and unrelenting boss battles regardless of where you are on the board. Somehow this makes Demon's Tilt look like a calm and relaxing experience, and you may need a little while to get used to all of the visual information on screen and learn to focus on where your ball is. They've also added some extra gameplay elements here, including gun turrets to clear the playfield of enemies whenever you cradle the ball, and a pretty cool multi-ball matrix that levels up various perks whenever you get a lock, and gives the potential of setting off a 9-ball multi-ball mode. Otherwise, the main experience is pretty similar to Demon's Tilt with starting protocols instead of rituals, And of course, always looking to jack up your multiplier to score billions of points and make your mark on the leaderboard. So far, I've had some pretty nice scores, but honestly, I wasn't too aware of what was actually happening most of the time, and I think it may take me some more practice and research to be doing things more deliberately, as opposed to simply reacting and keeping the ball alive. As far as extra modes beyond the normal experience, Hardcore mode has returned with increased difficulty and one ball only runs. Since the game is still in early access, there may be other modes released later on, like the return of EX mode from Xenotilt with added bonus rooms, and I also heard there may be something called Survivor mode with some kind of quest structure, and a time attack mode. I'm pretty excited to see what develops there, and we'll be keeping an eye out for sure. I can say in the first few days of the game being released, the developers are constantly putting out hot fixes and cleaning up whatever bugs they can. But so far, I've really only had one random soft lock, and the game's current state is very playable, at least on my setup. I should also mention they've continued their tradition of having tons of comfort options to customize your experience, vertical screen orientation support, various visual filters, and also some unlockable goodies as you get various achievements. Overall, I absolutely recommend picking this up if you're a fan of the fast-paced and frantic side of video pinball. Now don't expect any sort of simulated, realistic physics here. This is some arcadey, face-melting chaos, and it's a total blast once you start to get a good feel for it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the Billionaires Club. I can safely say this is the slimiest and one of the most unique Sega Genesis games out there that not a lot of people have played or maybe even heard of. And if they did try it, they probably didn't get very far due to its generally unforgiving difficulty. But I'm happy to report after a long drawn-out struggle stretched out over multiple years, I've finally conquered this viscous monstrosity and ready to give my personal take on the Ooze. Released somewhat late in the life of the Sega Genesis, the Ooze was developed by Sega Technical Institute, Sega's US-based studio that previously helped with multiple Sonic games and also produced hits like Kid Chameleon, Sonic Spinball, and Comix Zone. The Ooze was even considered to be included as a pack-in game with the handheld Sega Nomad system, but instead saw a mostly worldwide release by itself in 1995. The Japanese Mega Drive version is notably one of the most rare and valuable games for the system, with some pretty bizarre packaging. For starters, the cover art looks like censored newspaper headlines with a reversed version on the back that needs to be put up to a mirror to decode its cryptic message, and the instruction manual includes a cute bunny girl explaining the game to you along with her blood type, measurements, relationship status. Yeah, they basically just went totally off the wall here. Anyways, getting into the game itself, it fires up with a comic book-like cutscene and lore dump. You play as Dr. Daniel Kane, a scientist who discovers that the company he works for has been using his chemical research for a nefarious plan of unleashing a toxic gas upon the world while they hold the only cure and can sell it at whatever ridiculous costs they want. Once the corporation discovers Kane has realized this, they of course inject him with the chemical and flush him down the toilet. But instead of dying, he is transformed into a sentient toxic puddle of ooze hell-bent on revenge, and he embarks on a quest to stop the corporation and hopefully change back into human form. So you are controlling this puddle of slime in a top-down action framework with the ability to extend your goopy tendrils to smack and absorb the flesh of any enemies in your path, or also to set off various switches that open up new areas of the stage. You can also spit little slime ball loogie projectiles at your foes at the cost of a small amount of health. And rather than a typical health bar, your remaining life is essentially the size of your blobby body, and a bigger blob can also make you more susceptible to damaging foes and hazards, which is one of the most intriguing design elements of this game. Sometimes if a laser or something cuts through part of you, you can still go back and recover little bits of slime to restore some of that health. But if anything hits you in the head, it's an instant death. There are a handful of pickups as well, like temporary speed boosts, invincibility, checkpoints, extra lives, and the optional collectible DNA helices, which you will need all 50 of in order to see the best possible ending after completing the game's 5 levels, which are each split into 3 sections, and each ending with a boss fight. Now, before I unload all my gripes, there's really a lot to like about this game. The gameplay mechanics behind this whole Ooze pedal thing are really creative and impressive for its time, and it makes for a very unique experience on the console. It's also oozing with that edgy Genesis attitude, with very solid graphics, music, and burp sounds that are a great fit for building this B-movie Toxic Avenger-like vibe. The controls are weird at first, but it's functional once you come to grips with some of the nuance and your rather fluid hitbox. Despite all of this, the Ooze is generally an immensely frustrating time and feels like so much potential went down the drain. Now, I love a good hard game every once in a while, but the difficulty curve here is pretty insane. You start with 3 lives and no continues, while your only hope to last longer is to take more time exploring the stages in hopes of finding 1-ups, often hidden behind highly hazardous obstacles that might just cancel out your efforts anyway. The first level starts out pretty reasonable as you learn how the game works, but it doesn't take long before you need to endure through numerous instances of trial and error to find the safest paths through the sometimes rather expansive stages. And you'll have to do a lot of exploring to find the correct switches or warps to make progress, with the enemies and hazards getting more and more trolly as you go. The power core area is especially evil, with all sorts of traps and dirty tricks that you basically need advanced knowledge of in order to survive. And that's not even considering getting every single DNA pickup in each level, which further multiplies the challenge immensely, and this is a task I did not attempt. To make them even harder to find, some of the DNA is further hidden within obscured bonus stages where you have to devour a bunch of rabbits in a certain amount of time. Even getting the bad ending, where you're still stuck as a slime ball, caused me enough strife and suffering that I have zero desire to try for the better ending, which is marginally different anyways. It's not so much the trial and error that bothered me, but combining that with the lack of continues and the amount of time it takes to get through the larger switch-heavy stages made replaying the game pretty tedious. And I'm not sure if it was out of pure determination or luck on my part, but once I got to the game's final world for the first time, I was able to get through it fairly easily, so there's a weird imbalance there after the power core stage took so much work to get through. That was a level that truly broke me the first time I tried beating the game on stream back in 2020, and after several days of attempts I completely gave up on it, until over 3 years later I decided to get my revenge and finally slog through it again. And for the final stage and boss to be such a cakewalk was a little bit unsatisfying, but I'm still super relieved to finally be free of my slime-encrusted prison. You win? Yes! Ah! It's over! It's finally over! I think an option to continue or a password system would have helped a lot to make the game more reasonable. There is a level select code, but it's kind of absurdly complicated to execute, not to mention you won't be able to amass as many extra lives if you skip ahead. If you're not a glutton for punishment and still want to see this game through, you might consider using save states if that's an option for you. Now, I try to stay as positive as possible when surveying these old games, and on paper this could have been one of my all-time gross-out favorites on the Genesis. While there's certainly some disappointment here, I still have to recommend at least trying this one out, purely based on its uniqueness and concept, and I'll always applaud developers' attempts of trying something so off-kilter like this. I guess I would say to just be patient if you do take the plunge into this slimy, mucusy mess, and maybe you can keep your sanity from flushing down the toilet. Get ready for carnage with a capital K, where crying won't help you and neither will calling for your mommy. Misspelling stuff is so cool. So let's check out Skeleton Krew, a stylish isometric run and gun released in 1995 for the Amiga, Amiga CD, Mega Drive, and Sega Genesis, which is the version we'll mostly be looking at here, but I'll get into the differences later in the video. It was developed and published by Core Design, who would actually see a smash hit with Tomb Raider the following year, but here we have one of their final bits of output on the Genesis in the console's twilight years, and man, it is an edgy cyber slab of radness. The game opens up with a slick-looking cutscene setting the stage where moribund cadaver has turned Cryo City into a Monstro City, unleashing psychogenics mutant hordes to cause all sorts of chaos. So now it's up to the Skeleton Krew, 3 morbid mercenaries awoken from cryosleep who will do anything for the right amount of cash. This is all detailed further in the included comic and the manual as well, and they're fully committed to this whole K thing. What a glorious mess this manual is. Anyways, getting into the game, you can choose from rib, spine, and joint, with some slight differences in health and speed, but all with the same basic gun and grenade attacks, and unlimited ammo for both. The game also supports 2-player co-op, a few different difficulty modes, and 6-button controller support, which I highly recommend using. While this could have been an amazing twin-stick shooter, instead you'll be using buttons to rotate your torso while you fire away at the unending mobs of enemies. It definitely takes some getting used to, and you might consider configuring your controls in a way that makes sense to you. Once you get the hang of that, you'll be blasting away through 6 intergalactic levels full of beautiful isometric pixel art, drenched in futuristic, industrial, and otherworldly atmosphere. Aside from the generic beefcake mutants, you'll also be introduced to a few other enemies in each stage, along with a handful of weird and grotesque mini-bosses. You'll sometimes need to switch between your bullets and grenades depending on the situation, but you won't find any kind of power-ups or anything to change up your weaponry. In fact, the only thing you can pick up is cold hard cash, which is only useful for eventually building up enough to grant an extra life, which you might need if you're going for a hard mode clear or a 1cc or something. That the game's difficulty is rather reasonable otherwise. With some practice, you'll surely be making your way to Dead Headquarters for a showdown with Cadaver himself, and ultimately testing your moral fiber in a crucial decision to take him alive or in a bloody pile of gore. All in all, I think this is a really solid and fun shooter. It's definitely worth checking out for the art and music at least. The score provides some especially unique dark and moody ambiance, and will rinse your eardrums with ominous FM drones and deep bass tones. Speaking of the soundtrack, you really should also check out the music for each of the Amiga versions, which maybe doesn't really fit the game all that well, but delivers some ridiculously dope dark trip-hop beats by Martin Iveson. In these Amiga versions, they're alright. The graphics and general gameplay are about the same, and maybe it's the drop to 50 Hz, but it feels a little bit choppier and sloppier than the Genesis port. And the controls are a bit more troublesome, and it's also lacking a few enemy types here and there, and most notably doesn't have the extra final boss fight. It's still very playable if you're an Amiga enthusiast, or if you just want to see the minor differences here and there. And of the 2 versions, you'll probably want to go for the Amiga CD for the best sounding experience. Regardless of what version you play on, I will admit it does feel like some potential was lost here, as Skeleton Krew displays an example of style over substance. Maybe a little more variety in your weaponry, or a more substantial strategy difference between the 3 crew members would have been cool. More bosses could have been fun as well, as some of the stages don't have one, and they just kind of end after destroying random pylons or something. But those are just some minor complaints. I still think this game is super cool, and certainly want to encourage you to complete sometime. Often reviled as being one of the worst video games of all time, this title has long intrigued me from a distance, from its antiquated choice of source material to its outrageous cover art and unconventional gameplay mechanics. After finally putting in the effort to play through it myself and make a serious attempt to understand what the developers may have intended, I soon became very fascinated, and honestly a bit smitten with this unique experience, and can safely say there's a lot more to this unfairly maligned and misunderstood piece of gaming infamy. So with open minds and hearts, let's take a nice and slow walk through the world of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde on the NES. So this game was first released in Japan for the Famicom in 1988 as Homa ga Toki, published by Toho, a company much better known for its film and animation production. The game was also released in the US 1 year later, published by Bandai, with quite a few differences which we'll get into later. Development credits also include Advanced Communication Company, who worked on a handful of 8 and 16-bit games at the time, ranging from audacious titles like Dynowarz and Mecha Robot Golf, to some of the well-regarded early console conversions of the East series. The game lacks any production credits, but it's also generally assumed that the music was by Michiharu Hasuya, who also composed the music on Rygar. Because yeah, that title screen music is straight out of Rygar. Anyways, here they have taken on the bold task of adapting Robert Louis Stevenson's classic 1886 novella Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde into a video game for the first time. Perhaps an unusual choice of media for this landmark piece of gothic horror literature, but maybe not totally surprising considering it has been adapted hundreds of times into films, stage productions, and numerous other forms of media. Here's my quick high school book report summary. The well-respected Dr. Jekyll creates a drug that transforms him into a vicious alter ego, unleashing his innermost primal desires and repressed violent urges, and eventually losing control to his dark side. That's an immensely oversimplified summary. There are many deeper themes on duality and morality within that we'll touch on a bit more as we dig deeper into the game. So we start off controlling Dr. Jekyll, who is on his way to his wedding with Miss Millicent, a character not actually from the original book, but from one of the 1920s films. At first glance, this seems to be like a fairly typical action platformer game. You walk to the right, you can jump and duck, and you have a basic cane attack. But right away, you'll notice that your actions are extremely subdued. Jekyll's movement is rather polite, strolling ever so slowly through these Victorian-era settings, while the world around him is designed to irritate. From the townspeople to the poop-dropping wildlife, everything seems to be out to get you, reducing your life meter and increasing your stress meter, all while you can't really do a whole lot to fight back. With the exception of the bees, your cane will not fend off anything, a quirk that will often bewilder and confuse new players. And once your stress meter hits full capacity, Jekyll loses control to his Hyde persona, transporting you to a world of demons, a crumbling and dilapidated version of London filled with bizarre and surreal creatures. Now as Mr. Hyde, the screen will auto-scroll back to the left as you push your stress meter back to the Jekyll side by defeating any enemies in your path with either a simple punch attack or your trademark Psycho Wave, an erratic fireball thing that is apparently cool enough to be promoted on the front of the North American box art. These sections are remarkably different from the Jekyll gameplay, with a much faster paced action and character movement. Basically, you'll need to stay alive and kill enough enemies before reaching the inverted point of progress in the stage that Jekyll had made it to. Otherwise, you'll be instantly blasted by lightning and game over. Now you do get unlimited continues at least. And like many old NES games, these concepts are explained in the manual, but certainly not very clear if you just turn this on and start playing without reading that first. So what often happens for probably 90% of first-time players who don't know what to expect here, you walk around as Jekyll for a few seconds, maybe trying to hit stuff with your cane, it doesn't do anything, and then one of these bomb maniac guys absolutely wrecks you. Then you turn into Hyde, and you excitedly shoot things for a few seconds, but quickly get a game over since you didn't make much progress with Jekyll. And without much more effort than that, I totally get that one can assume the game is garbage. And honestly, I wouldn't recommend this game to someone looking for a straightforward fun action game. But if you're like me and willing to delve into the murky depths of jank and experience something a bit more unconventional, I'd say this one is worth a deeper look. First of all, you'll need to develop some tactics to survive as long as possible as Jekyll, and come to the reality that sometimes you just can't really avoid getting stressed out. And in another true-to-life concept, things are pretty unpredictable. Townspeople will suddenly start moving very quickly and bump into you, little Billy will shoot you with his slingshot, birds will drop giant piles of poo on you, singing ladies will spray dissonant notes all over the screen until you pay them to shut up anyways. Cats, dogs, spiders, bees, dead ducks, grave diggers, barrels, there's a lot of nonsense Jekyll has to deal with, all while retaining his composure as a distinguished member of society. Most importantly though, you really need to be careful around these bomb maniacs. Once you run into one of these guys, he drops a bomb and you need to get as far away from it as you can, as the inconsistent hitbox of the explosion is much larger than its sprite. Eventually you'll even need to carefully time a jump while you run away, or potentially take a massive hit to your health and stress levels. And once you're in Hyde form, you can finally have some fun, let your violent side cut loose and unleash your barrage of psycho waves, and even move and jump around at a more video gamey speed. But there are certainly some control quirks to contend with here as well. Your auto-scrolling movement is limited to the right half of the screen, and it's worth mentioning that while you can jump on your own, Hyde will automatically jump over any steps or obstacles in his path, sometimes right into a flying rock monster thing. Also, executing your Psycho Wave might not be obvious to use at first, as you'll need to press up and B to use this attack. Otherwise you'll just be punching, which does work alright on some enemies, but those erratic flying creatures will be much harder to deal with, especially with stronger and weirder beasts appearing the further you get into the game. I found that punching actually comes more in handy as a defensive tactic to destroy any incoming projectiles. So other than those strats, you'll basically just want to kill as many enemies as you can, take as little damage as you can, and then get back to Jekyll form, which will also restore a good amount of health after the transformation is complete. This back and forth struggle between your alternating good and evil egos will not only cause you to ponder the duality of human nature, but also really make you hate barrels. And finally, at the game's conclusion, you will reach the church for this end? That's it? Okay, not quite. Things get even weirder on the final stage, as the game's true ending is found by first reaching the church as Hyde. And this is not explained in the manual, by the way. So basically, once you reach the final level, you'll intentionally transform, preferably by losing as little health as possible, endure a rather difficult rooftop battle that includes a few instant death pitfalls, until you eventually reach the church and a final boss battle. Now the footage here is from the Famicom version. This one shows a creepy hanging body from the church cross once you beat the boss. And then you turn back into Jekyll and can enjoy a stress-free walk to the church, and you actually get to see your lovely Millicent and enjoy an animated wedding procession sequence, and a nice little jump scare as well, as a poignant reminder that the Hyde in all of us will always be there. And these different endings were some of the most fascinating things about this game to me, where you're not rewarded with the better ending by completely trying to suppress Hyde, but rather to attain a balance between the two. The stark contrasts in gameplay between the game's modes really reinforce this concept as well, with Jekyll's gameplay being what I consider to be intentionally frustrating and annoying, and actually instilling and encouraging those primal urges of the player to just be able to unleash carnage as Hyde. Now, I'm not going to claim that the philosophical underpinnings of the novella translated flawlessly into a video game, but I have to applaud the effort that was made to attempt such a thing. So I mentioned the Famicom version earlier, and I should say that it has quite a lot more content than what we got in the US. Due to modifications made to the cartridge board in the North American release, many of the graphics were cut or simply made inaccessible, including 2 entire levels and many sprites and enemy types. The US version still has the same number of levels, but instead just recycles the backgrounds in 2 of them. Notably, the Japanese version also adds things like people throwing garbage out of their windows, and even some occupied houses that you can go into that will either help or hurt you. The demon world also gets this exclusive siren-like enemy, which plays some different music while on screen. And weirdly enough, the North American manual still mentions these omitted game elements, so it may have been written before they had to make the cartridge modifications. So if you do have the choice, I'd say the Famicom version is the definitive one to play, and it's maybe a little bit more difficult as well. Now in the end, I'm really glad I gave this game a proper chance. Obviously it has its flaws, and I'm not going to necessarily recommend it to everyone. You really need to be open-minded and patient here, and absorb this one more like an 8-bit allegory as opposed to a good old jump 'em up. I do think it's a shame that it has garnered such a negative reputation, as I can list off plenty of more incoherent and low-effort NES games that weren't trying something so unique like this. I guess if anything, it's a good reminder that one person's trash is another's treasure, or that some of the most interesting things in life will take a little more effort to uncover. And don't forget to let out a few of those pent-up psycho waves every once in a while. And if you've dared to play this one, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Alright, and here we are looking at Oratorio, a new rhythm action rail shooter for the NES, and I can safely say I've never experienced anything quite like this for the system. This was made by John Vanderhoof, and recently saw a full release in 2023, and was a winner of the NES Maker Bite Off 3 competition Wombat Award, which is presented to the most surprising, unique, or unexpected game created. Before diving into this review, I will give a quick photosensitivity warning up front here. The game does have some occasional screen flashing and very trippy visual effects. I'll also mention that the developer did gift me a copy of this game, but any opinions here are my own, and I'm not being paid for this review. With that out of the way, let's log in. So we've got a pretty cool story set up here, drenched in post-apocalyptic dystopian cyberpunk goodness. You play as a hacker named Oratorio, intent on infiltrating the servers of a corrupt megacorporation that is hoarding the DNA of extinct flora and fauna into a proprietary digital ark. And you are the last hope for revival of this dying world. The gameplay takes heavy inspiration from the games Rez and Child of Eden, works of Tetsuya Mizuguchi that were highly influential in integrating interactive synesthesia into video games, and they push forward an innovative combination of rhythm and on-rails shooter genres. Oratorio approaches this on an 8-bit platform by having you control an on-screen cursor, and each of your shots will create another layer of the musical soundtrack with an open-ended rhythm of your choosing. It might sound a little weird and choppy at first, but it won't take long until you get into a groove and blast away at the skittering robotic and bug-like enemies all over the screen. Luckily, there is no punishment for being off rhythm, so don't worry if you're not inclined to keep a steady and consistent beat, as you'll probably just notice that your shooting will stay locked into the tempo of that particular stage, regardless of your button mashing. I'll also mention that Oratorio does not have that automatic lock-on mechanic of Rez, so you'll take a much more active role in being precise with your movement and shooting, especially as the speed of the enemies ramps up and their patterns get more erratic. The main game mode features 5 stages with several layers within each, essentially having you blast through all the digital critters and oncoming projectiles in your path without running out of health. You can also accumulate screen-clearing bombs in case you ever get overwhelmed. Each stage also has its own musical framework, which nicely builds up and even changes in tempo as you progress into an eventual crescendo with a boss fight. I was able to finish the main mode of the game in about an hour, but some other modes beyond that include Surf, which just lets you play without worrying about damage, and an endless score attack mode. Overall, I was really impressed on what was accomplished with this game. Visually, it's one of the most psychedelic experiences I've seen on the NES, with some really cool trippy backgrounds that change and evolve often, and I rarely experienced any slowdown despite the wealth of things happening on the screen. And even in those rare moments, the interactive musical backing was unaffected, so it was barely noticeable. I was also surprised that this was made with NES Maker, a beginner-friendly engine for making NES games. And this is by no means a knock against the software or anything, but once you play enough NES homebrew, you can kinda tell when a game was made with one of the standard game templates that it offers. And Oratorio goes well off of that path, and into a genre hybrid that I can't think of any other examples of on the system. I do have a couple of minor gripes, first of which being that the game felt too easy. In my first playthrough, I got a deathless run, and only took damage a few times. Not that every game has to be NES hard or whatever, but once I knew how to prioritize taking out incoming projectiles immediately, there wasn't much tension left. Unfortunately, that lack of challenge carries over into the endless mode as well, which felt a bit more like an endurance test than a test of skill. I also found the scoring system to be flawed, as while there are optional target scores to be accomplished for each stage, you can honestly just farm points by letting enemies live a little bit longer and just keep shooting their projectiles. So that task feels more tedious than actually challenging. That being said, you can certainly impose your own challenges for this game, as I think it would be tough to pull off a damageless victory, or perhaps routing out a speedrun could also get pretty interesting. Despite that, I still really recommend checking this game out. It's a pleasure to play, and a true 8-bit feast for the eyes and ears. And again, it's a very unique experience on the NES, and really refreshing to see something that encourages such player creativity and experimentation. I'll have a link in the description where you can check out the demo or purchase the game, and make sure to check out the developer's other projects as well, including more NES games and even some interactive fiction taking place in the same universe as Oratorio. And if you're interested in more recently made games for the NES, check out this video I just finished that covers a bunch of really cool homebrew horror titles for the system. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time. I don't want a lot for Christmas. There's just one thing I need. I don't care about the presents underneath the Christmas tree. I just want a custom holiday card maker on my Famicom Disk System. Oh hey, here's one. This is Santa Claus no Takarabako, aka Santa Claus's Treasure Chest, published only in Japan by Data East in 1987. Yes, the legendary company behind Karnov and Bad Dudes would also dip into creativity software for the Famicom, where you can pick from 3 different festive screens, 3 different holiday songs, type in a personalized message, hit run, and then slather yourself in 8-bit festive cheer. And if you're not a Santa fan, you can even make your own 2-frame animated sprite to saunter around the bottom of the screen. And being that it's on the Famicom Disk System, you can save your countless hours of work spent on your craft, and then show off your masterpiece to the fam on Christmas morning, or maybe even pass off the disc to your weird uncle who has a disk system of his own. And these days, you could get even more creative with the magic of video editing. Maybe add some little snow effects, add your own music or voice, let your creativity run wild. The program itself works well enough for what it is. There are certainly some quirky things going on. The menus themselves are a little bit confusing to control, as you'll need to use Start and Select to navigate between different option screens, or use various unintuitive button combinations to do various things like change between the Santa or custom sprites. You're also unfortunately stuck with these 4 colors for the custom sprite, as it would have been cool to at least choose from a few different palettes. But it was good enough for me to make my own cursed Karnov. The 3 different scenes and music choices are pretty decent, and do take advantage of the expanded audio capabilities of the Famicom Disk System. So yeah, it's pretty basic, but it's a cute idea for a very specific use case. And if we go back to the main menu here, we do have some party games included. 'Tis the season for degenerate gambling. With bingo, roulette, slots, and poker dice, you can turn your Christmas party into a scene out of Scorsese's Casino. The original version of this came with some bingo cards and a map of the roulette wheel for placing bets. So other than the slot machine, the game itself doesn't really keep track of anything for you. It just facilitates the gambling goodness that brings your family and friends together. And in case you're wondering, poker dice is basically a simplified version of Yahtzee. And I guess you just need to keep track of your own score on whatever rolls you get. Overall, this is pretty bottom-of-the-barrel stuff that just seems added on to pad out the software a bit, and it's especially a snooze fest now if you don't have the physical goodies that have since become somewhat valuable to Famicom collectors. But getting back to the focus here, this is a nice little app if you want to bring some 8-bit holiday cheer to your loved ones. If anyone out there decides to make something from this, I'd love to hear about it. Thanks for watching, and happy holidays, folks. So after all these years, I finally played through Castlevania 64, a game I kind of remember renting when it came out, but not having any very strong feelings or memories of it, and a game that would eventually become the brunt of much scorn in an onslaught of angry game reviews looking back upon this oddity of the series. But with an open mind and heart, I brushed off my past dismissal of the N64 as a whole, and dove right into this experience, drenched with fog and dread, and surprisingly embarked on a brain-breaking personal journey of multi-dimensional proportions.
Courage. Don't leave me.
I've been a fan of the older Castlevania games since I was a kid, with very fond memories of the NES titles, yes, even Simon's Quest in some ways, along with the absolute bangers on SNES and the Genesis, and of course the now-renowned masterpiece Symphony of the Night. But the series' first foray into 3D was always a bit of an outlier. I'd say it's easy for even the hardcore fans of that system to admit that the N64 in general has aged weirdly. It was the Wild West of 3D game development, and the cartridge-based console would seem to be increasingly difficult for developers to work with, resulting in those low-poly universes lacking very much draw distance and washed over with texture blur, and often viewed through the lens of a chaotic camera operator. As 3D gaming would get more and more refined, this era of games has seen its fair share of reviling, admittedly myself included in that. In the past, I've memed about playing N64 as being some form of psychological torture, which maybe isn't too off base in a few specific exceptions. But in parallel to that, I've also become immensely appreciative of experiencing what you could call jank. Games full of imperfections, awkwardness, and unconventional design, adorned with cursed and raw pixel art that doesn't conform to any trends. There's something uniquely charming about these so-called awful games, not only as an alternative to the overpolished and bloated modern AAA titles being churned out today, but as a fun and satisfying way to overcome the challenges of wonky and weird play controls, or navigating through programming seemingly held together by duct tape, doing your best to keep the game world from coming apart at the seams. Your mileage may vary, but the deeper I dig into the janky side of video game history, I find this world to be immensely fun to explore. So getting back to Castlevania 64, while starting it up for the first time in years, I was intentionally open-minded to have some fun on stream with the janky mess that I thought would likely ensue, but was honestly surprised. This game wasn't nearly the level of hot mess that some pockets of the internet would have you believe it to be. Despite the burden of high expectation as a Castlevania title, which up to that point was one of the most beloved 2D horror action franchises of the era, it's pretty clear to see the intent of the game design here, and it was an admirable experiment into unknown territories. The game starts out in a quiet and very foggy forest as you awkwardly fumble around with a new control scheme, coming to terms with targeting unending hordes of skeletons, exploring this muddy-looking world in search of switches to open gates, also while quickly finding out that the camera is likely being controlled by Dracula himself, as it will undoubtedly cause you to fall off of a platform or two. Compared to the usual rock opera-driven whip-cracking action we were used to, Castlevania 64 starts out with a pretty drastic contrast. And as you keep pushing forward, the game gets further ambitious and starts making full use of that magical third dimension that has been opened up here. Boss fights take on a more massive and impactful scale, powered with the freewheeling creative juice in the now iconic skeletons on motorcycles. At this point, you can tell Konami wanted to have some fun with this too, and certainly had to have been a monumental challenge to undertake. Building brand new tools alongside such an ambitious project that ultimately had a lot of content trimmed off in order to actually get released in a timely fashion, we'd eventually get an enhanced remake prequel kind of thing called Legacy of Darkness to revive some of the additional stuff, a game that I definitely want to explore further at some point. Speaking of exploring, as you delve further into the castle, the game leans more into the exploration aspect, blending in some survival horror vibes and mechanics executed successfully by games like the original Resident Evil, and eventually puts you through a notoriously tricky chase sequence through a hedge maze, and the now infamous Magical Nitro section.
Oh, Magical Nitro. Okay. Just running will not cause an explosion, but one jump or hit and the story's over. Carry it carefully. Oh no. Wait, one jump? What? What? That's pretty good. Oh, I jumped. God. I just can't get hit. Ah, no. He's gonna hit me, I know it, yep. I am gonna... Oh, God. Whoa. No! What? What the... That's... Why am I not thinking straight there now?
It's undeniably an annoying and absolutely troll moment of the game, but actually rather satisfying to finally get through if you have the patience. And from there, the game shifts focus again into more action-packed combat and platforming areas. By this point, I was feeling much more comfortable with the controls and was having an unexpected amount of fun in this world, and really realizing how impressive all of this was for the time. It's probably a victim of a bit of a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none syndrome, where all the ideas don't necessarily gel together into a cohesive way, and the levels felt a little disjointed if you look at the big picture. But for the time, this pastiche of different mechanics in a richly atmospheric world was absolutely a brave experiment that executed on its intentions well enough and surely set a subtle new standard for 3D action games to follow. Rather than dig too much deeper into the game's content and mechanics, which has honestly been done very well already in a few other videos I've seen that have re-examined this game with a similar optimistic lens, let's get a little personal here. If anything, this whole experience of dusting off this old neglected console seemed to run parallel to a lot of other things in my own life that have been running through my mind lately. When going through some difficult changes, I found a lot of benefit in discovering new perspectives. Not unlike this awkward and somewhat painful shift from 2 to 3 dimensions, broadening your scope to new ideas and opinions can unlock so many new ways of thinking and transforming your mindset in ways to improve your outlook on life. Realizing my dismissal of the N64 library might be keeping me away from finding gems in the rough like this one, and realizing that closed-mindedness could be leaking through in other ways. It was a perfect reminder to approach things without expectations, as their influence on your experience and enjoyment might be more affected by this than you think. Just stay positive and let the jank wash over you. Aside from that, Castlevania 64 also proved to be an injection of creative energy in my own work, reaffirming the importance of experimenting, trying fresh approaches to problems to see what works and what doesn't. Keep failing over and over again and have fun in the process. Persevere long enough, and you will find that path. And don't panic if it wasn't the original one you thought you had set out on. Accept things for what they are, embrace imperfections, and use technical limitations as a way to be even more creative with your problem solving. The struggle is the thing that makes victory feel so sweet in the end. Thanks for watching, and a super special thanks to those supporting on Patreon and on Twitch, as this game was selected for a new monthly content poll for supporters that have just started. Obviously, I was pleasantly surprised and profoundly changed by this one, and truly appreciate those who believe in what I'm doing. We'll catch you next time. Remember Bart Mania? It was the early 90s, The Simpsons was a smash hit after its first season, and everyone's favorite spiky-haired, rebellious 4th grade hero was plastered all over t-shirts. Don't have a cow man was a household idiom, and kids everywhere were doing the Bart man. Bart would naturally find himself the star of a slew of his own video games as well, but one odd one we'll be exploring today is a DOS exclusive that has languished in obscurity, Bart's House of Weirdness. Following the successful Simpsons arcade game by Konami, the Juggernaut merchandising push placed Bart at the forefront of 8 video games of his own, starting off with Bart vs. the Space Mutants, which was ported to 9 different consoles and computer platforms, and all the way up to the infamously strange 16-bit Virtual Bart on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Most Simpsons games to follow wouldn't be as Bart-centric, but he certainly had a wild run of titles with him as the protagonist, many often reviled for their jankiness and sometimes brutal difficulty, but usually at least somewhat appreciated for their creativity and reverence to the source material. While Acclaim had a stranglehold on exclusively publishing Bart games on consoles and handhelds, Konami quietly dropped this oddity on PC, releasing Bart's House of Weirdness on January 1st, 1992, a generally rough time of year to release a new game, and also about a month after Bart vs. the World had been released on the NES. Development was done by Distinctive Software, a Canadian studio that Konami had worked with many times previously on their other DOS titles like Castlevania, Super C, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Manhattan Missions. And Distinctive would also go on to get bought out by Electronic Arts in 1991 and become EA Canada, where many EA Sports branded games are still pumped out regularly to this day. Weirdness of the release situation aside, let's get into the weirdness of the game. Bart's House of Weirdness is a subconscious interpretation of reality as Bart would like it to be. It presents him with the opportunity to project the hero-conqueror role on his own persona, thereby regaling himself to the status of world savior, framed as a social commentary of the state of our culture as seen through the eyes of a child of the nuclear age. Okay, so that's part of Dr. Marvin Monroe's pretentious prologue from the beginning of the instruction manual, but he's not wrong. In layman's terms, you're Bart. You've been sent to your room, which essentially acts as a level hub to various daydreams in the form of side-scrolling platformer stages. So in some ways, it acts as a predecessor to Bart's Nightmare and Virtual Bart, as far as the variety and dreamlike setup goes, but probably not quite as unhinged and surreal as those 16-bit titles. I should also mention Bart's room has a few little extra goodies as well, ranging from a Walkman that lets you demo the game's music tracks, a Krusty doll that says random stuff, and a Sideshow Bob punching bag that will eventually spawn this photo of Marge. In my first playthrough, I did not know about this ahead of time, and I didn't remember the episode it's referencing either, so I was a bit bewildered by this at the time of discovery. Getting back to the gameplay, the controls are somewhat stiff, not too far removed from other classic cinematic platformers on PC like Prince of Persia or Out of This World, with screen-by-screen side-scrolling action unfolding before you as you make your way to a specific item to end the stage. The first 6 levels can be completed in any order, also gradually giving Bart little upgrades like a cool hat, cool shades, and cool shoes. And then you can finally embark on the final mission of rescuing Krusty the Clown, who has been imprisoned by Sideshow Bob. Within the levels, there are also a variety of weapon and ammo drops that you'll need to fend off an absolute onslaught of enemies and hazards in your path, including a burp gun, dart gun, slingshot, spray paint, and water balloons. And I'm not exaggerating the onslaught. Every single screen is loaded with stuff trying to make you uncool, which of course means death for Bart. The difficulty curve is rather intense and can be pretty off-putting to new players, as your first tries on a screen will undoubtedly lead to you getting constantly bounced around by bees, aliens, squirrels, bombs, cops, worms, skeletons, you name it. The knockback is pretty fierce, and each screen resets itself every time it loads, so some very patient trial and error is your best bet to come up with a good strategy for navigating every hectic situation ahead. And honestly, the first hour or two of this game can get pretty discouraging, and clearing even a single level can feel rather impossible. Certain moments are unarguably irritating as hell to figure out. But knowledge is power, and enough experimentation will eventually lead to success, and luckily, you can also save scum your way to victory with Bart's dresser drawer if you need to. And if you're a Simpsons fan, I think it's at least worth some perseverance to see the source material honored so well here. With all sorts of fun references to early Simpsons episodes, you'll search high and low outside the house for Maggie's red ball, scrounge together $5 from the mall and Mr. Burns' well-fortified mansion just to catch a movie, face off with the babysitter bandit in the basement, snatch the cookbook from Space Mutants, battle all sorts of creepy critters and audacious knockback in the attic, and even traverse through a chaotic and explosive Itchy and Scratchy cartoon. And even though they're all platformers at their core, each daydream feels a little varied in terms of what gameplay mechanics are emphasized, sometimes focused on pure hazard avoidance, some on exploration, and some almost Metroidvania-like, with certain items being needed to safely make progress. And all of this comes to fruition in the finale, where you need to climb a log-filled waterfall from hell and pitfall-inspired gator hopping, all while collecting enough oversized burp gun ammo to defeat Sideshow Bob. Even if the sometimes excruciatingly tough gameplay proves to be too annoying for you, I think most can at least appreciate the effort put into the presentation here. The graphics look really nice here right out the gate, with some impressive cutscenes to start out, and really nice and colorful sprites and backgrounds during the gameplay. It's certainly a step above what we were getting on the NES at the time, despite the lack of continuous screen scrolling. And regarding sound, your experience may vary depending on the sound card settings you go with. If you can handle emulating the Roland MT32, I found the music to sound the best when going that route, and provides a pretty great soundtrack and some basic sound effects. Alternatively, you can also choose a different audio device that allows for some nice and crunchy voice samples as well.
Okie dokie.
Other features are limited, but there is a hard mode option that you can enable at any time, which doesn't really change the levels or even the game's ending, but it does slightly alter your ammo capacity and length of invincibility frames. And weirdly, there is a VCR mode, which lets you record your own gameplay and re-watch it, even frame by frame if you want. Not super useful, but also not something you saw very often in 1992. All in all, I think everything gels together pretty nicely and is a worthy tribute to the Simpsons cartoon, and not really deserving some of the ire I've seen on worst Simpsons games lists or other highly visible reviews that just trash the game without even bothering to complete a stage. I guess I just have to stress the need for patience on this one, and remember Bart's mantra, don't have a cow, man. Yet another fine example of a janky video game reinforcing helpful life advice. Don't be afraid to embrace failure for a while until you figure out what works. And thanks so much for watching, folks, and also special thanks to supporters on Patreon and Twitch who voted for this game this month. It's thanks to your help I can keep focusing on doing what I love and creating fun videos for y'all. We'll catch you next time. A lot of 8-bit action platformers often have this expectation or reputation of being NES hard. Brutal and punishing games that don't care about your feelings. Or maybe they were just trying to keep kids from beating games in a single weekend rental. But sometimes, don't you just want to be a big robot dinosaur, stomping and punching your way through outer space without trying too hard? Well, if I got a game for you, it's Dynowarz, the destruction of Spondylus. Dynowarz was published by Bandai in 1990, one of a few interesting NES titles that saw exclusive releases in North America, along with Dick Tracy, The Rocketeer, Frankenstein, Monster Party, and a handful of others. Developing duties were handled by Advanced Communication Company, whose other works on the NES included ports of the East series, along with the infamous Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. With an easy target of dominating the untapped niche of robot dinosaur games on the NES in North America, Dynowarz with a Z would lay claim to the genre, while IPs like Zoids and even Dinobots from Transformers would be nowhere to be found. Japan did get a handful of Zoids RPGs and strategy games, and one Transformers run-and-gun game of dubious quality, but none of these ever came stateside. So if you're 9 years old and as obsessed with dinosaurs as I was, the Dynowarz cover art was like a tractor beam of radness. Special shout out to the extremely cool Nintendo Power poster too. So the game takes place in the Spondylus solar system, with you in control of Professor Proteus, a brilliant scientist and founder of the Robosaur project. But as each planet's central life support computer becomes infected with an unknown virus and becomes overrun with out-of-control Robosaurs, the professor realizes it's the doings of the deranged Dr. Brainius, a former colleague previously busted for conducting forbidden robotics experiments on humans, and he has returned to seek revenge using the professor's own Robosaurs against him. But enter the magnificent Cyborosaurus, Proteus's ultimate creation, which he must pilot himself to save the solar system. Now all of this juicy plot is only provided by the manual, by the way, with no mention of any sort of story or characters at all while you're in the game. The best you'll get in that department is a couple of repeated cutscenes between entering and exiting your robot dino buddy. Which actually brings us to how the levels are structured. There are 7 levels total, each split between man mode and dinosaur mode. The game kicks off with you in control of a little Professor Proteus armed with a spread shotgun and an impressively high jump, facing off with flying hounds of destruction in his lab, which of course has giant spikes everywhere, and eventually hopping into his trusty Cyborosaurus, at which point you can stomp around the planet's surface, fight your way through an onslaught of compromised Robosaurs and hazards, until reaching a boss and computer portal. Once the boss is beaten and the key obtained, you hop back out and enter the planet's artificial intelligence compound on foot, running and gunning your way to the infected core, blasting it to bits, and then traversing back through the compound once more until you're back in your dino and can teleport to the next planet on the list. The same routine repeats itself until the very end of the game. While on the surface, you might think there's some cool Blaster Master kind of thing going on here, where you can go in and out of your sweet vehicle, but unfortunately it's all scripted out in the way the stages are broken up, and you have no autonomy in that case. Both modes play fairly similarly as well, but with a few differences. Man mode areas are focused a bit more on platforming, with single screen rooms often full of moving or dropping platforms and a handful of enemies. You only have your spreadshot weapon, but it can be upgraded once with a power-up that will double your fire rate. You're pretty limited on the number of projectiles you can have on the screen at once, which can be a bit annoying sometimes, but also encourages more deliberately executed shooting as you aim for enemies or turrets. Your jumping requires some forethought as well, with a slight delay as you end up crouching briefly before a jump, and some of the platform cycles requiring surprisingly tight timing. And you'll also have to take into account some pretty strict collision boxes for properly landing on anything. Dinosaur mode is decidedly more clompy, with a heavier feeling jump and more focus on dino battling. Think Godzilla, but with less environmental destruction and cool atomic breath. You start with a basic punch attack, which is about as useful as you would expect from something modeled after a tiny-armed T-Rex. You could also pick up weapon power-ups including the Fireball, Laser Beam, Bomb Shot, and the bewilderingly weird Launch Fist, all of which can be upgraded twice. The power-ups don't disappear, by the way, so often you might even find yourself in a situation where a new power-up is a hazard on its own, as you lose your devastating level 3 Fireball to an ill-placed fist drop. You also get a 1 use per level satellite defense weapon attack, which wipes the screen of enemies, but it can really only be used on the first section of these dinosaur stages. Enemies include a wide variety of robot dinosaurs of all species and sizes, from these tiny little hoppy babies that can still knock you to your doom, or all the way to the damaged sponge Tricerabots. Little landmines and turrets also pepper the landscape you're stomping through, and while it can be a bit difficult to avoid occasional damage, luckily you have a very generous amount of health, along with sporadic items to refill your life or a barrier that will even stop any knockback from occurring. The mini-bosses are pretty generic, usually not much unlike anything else you fight in the stages anyway, and are generally no problem to deal with assuming you have a bit of health left to tank them. I guess that brings me to one gripe about this game. A lot of it feels very recycled and repetitive at a point. You'll fight several of the same dinosaur mini-bosses multiple times with very little differences in their behaviors. The man mode compounds reuse the same assets and even some of the same room layouts, again with very generic enemies, and also the same behavior for the ending virus battles. Not to mention you have to backtrack through the same rooms without enemies just to leave the stage. The basic cutscenes, as nice as they look, are also reused often, music is reused, and yeah, I think you get the idea here. Despite that, something about this game just feels so damn cozy. I did play this quite a lot when I was a kid, so maybe it's nostalgia goggles to blame, but it's still nice to be able to take a casual, stompy stroll through this world, loaded with plenty of health, unlimited continues, and generous checkpoints, and just live your life as a plodding Cyborosaurus, fisting your way through the galaxy. It's a pretty easy and admittedly boring game, probably targeting a younger audience at the time, but oddly now very suitable for a worn down and tired old man like me. And a nice little afternoon romp if you're looking for a chill NES game to add to your gaming conquests. Now, of course, there are ways to make it harder on yourself, and recently I figured I'd learn the speedrun for this, and surprisingly uncovered a pretty intense run fraught with perilous moments and ridiculous amounts of lag and eaten inputs. Playing through the game normally and fighting everything in your path at a casual pace, you might not encounter this lag as much. But once enough objects are on the screen and the slowdown occurs, you'll often run into unresponsive controls. So the speedrun basically leads to finding a balance between managing lag, damage boosting as much as you safely can, routing out the item pickups accordingly to stay alive, and ultimately finishing the game deathless in order to keep your weapons powered up. It actually lends itself to pretty tense moments full of risk and reward, and has been a surprisingly challenging endeavor in my short amount of time learning the run. Now, I'm not gonna lie and call this game a masterpiece by any means, especially with the input-eating jank and recycled assets, but it's still something I come back to often, and can easily recommend playing through it sometime. I do really wish a sequel could have been made back then, something maybe with more variety of dinosaurs to play as, or just a bit more complexity in the level design or game mechanics. The concept was pretty rad for its time. They surely nailed the misleading cover art aspect, but it's probably safe to assume the devs here didn't have a whole lot of time to work with and just had to pump this one out fairly quickly. Squandered opportunity or not, I'd say it's still worth a stomp sometime. Thanks for watching, we'll catch you next time. Remember Alfmania? Okay, maybe not, since that wasn't actually a thing, but from 1986 to 1990, everyone's favorite hairy and snarky alien life form from Melmac had a pretty successful TV run, paving the way for puppetry into evening sitcoms, and inspiring youngsters to drink beer and microwave their cats.
It's not soda pop, it's beer.
You're about out of Coors.
The Alphaverse would expand into comics, cartoons, toys, and a handful of games, with today's title we're checking out being the only one released for a home video game console, and therefore the best. Or I guess technically also the worst. It's Alf on the Sega Master System. Alf on the Master System was released in 1989 exclusively in North America, one of the few SMS games not to be released abroad in other regions. It was developed by Nexa, with the bulk of the programming done by Kevin Saghetti, only 20 years old at the time, and just his second game after his work on Monopoly for the Master System as well. It's also worth mentioning at the time Nexa was a part of Spectrum Holobyte, which eventually went on to acquire Microprose, and then eventually absorbed into Hasbro in the late 90s. Even more curious is how the original founder of Nexa, Gilman Louie, is now a member of the Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board and the U.S. Department of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. Clearly, we can thank this game for his rise to prominence. Getting into the game's premise, similarly to the story of the TV show, we find that Alf has crash-landed on Earth in the backyard of the Tanner family. His home planet was destroyed, but he hopes to reconvene with his Melmacian friends Skip and Rhonda, who have made their way to Mars. So it's up to you to help Alf find the necessary items and solve all the problems in his path to refueling his space scooter and blasting off into space, all the while being hunted down by the alien task force, amongst dealing with other various hazards in his way. The gameplay can be best described as a rudimentary adventure game mixed with platforming elements. Maybe even a simplified Metroidvania kind of situation, if you like to throw that term around. You'll need to explore for necessary items within the Tanner family home, the city streets and shops, bat-infested caves, cat-shark-infested waters, and ultimately the upper atmospheres of the planet to fly off into the stars. The manual gives you a few little hints to get started, but your patience will surely be tested a bit as you start out without much guidance or clarity on what to do next. But the first true obstacle you'll run into is Alf's play control and unforgiving hitbox, as your big and beautiful Alfer dies in one hit after getting anywhere near the myriad of rats, bats, bugs, bikers, and perverts. The only way to deal with them is to wear a $200 clown costume, obviously. But then an even faster dog will just eat that, and then the grabby hands jerks will just start showing up once more. Alf's only real offensive capability, other than his occasional jokes, is a giant stick of salami, which obviously is the only way to deal with bats living in a secret cave underneath your basement. This area actually requires a lot of precision in your jumping and combat, and often becomes the wall for most sane gaming enthusiasts to just turn the game off. But enough perseverance will get you to continue to progress through the next item in the chain of what you need to keep moving onward. You only get a handful of lives and one continue, but luckily the game is rather short once you know the sequence of events and get more resilient against the jank to be encountered. Throw some speedrun strats into the mix too, and you might be able to beat it in 5 or 6 minutes if the RNG cooperates. And you know those strats must be going hard when the world record pulls off moves like the auspicious double salami buster technique. So here comes the part of the review where I have to come to Alf's defense a bit. It's certainly been trashed on over the years as being one of the worst titles on the Sega Master System, and considered somewhat of an ugly abomination of an adventure game. But again, I like to have a wider outlook here. Actually playing through the game entirely ends up being pretty amusing, ranging from some of the goofy sprite work to a genuinely funny troll item, which I won't spoil in this video for the 1% of you that might actually play this someday. And it's got a surprisingly catchy soundtrack, considering they only had a $200 budget for sound, and I guess it's just a general lighthearted experience of figuring out the puzzles and dealing with some surprisingly challenging sections. Now, I can't exactly label this game as well made, but considering it was a 20-year-old second gig programming a game, and was also certainly rushed to commercial release despite its crude state, it's probably comparable to E.T. on the Atari 2600 in the fact that it doesn't really deserve as much hate as it has in the typical poop-flinging reviews of its past, most of which probably didn't bother actually beating the game. I think if you're either a fan of the character or janky adventure games in general, it's a game worth hopping through at least once, and undoubtedly a curious point in the history of the Master System. And while this Alf iteration was the only one for a game console, Alf did make a few appearances on home computers. Alf the First Adventure had been released previously for the Apple II, DOS, Commodore 64, and Atari ST, taking the form of an arcade-style maze game, seeing him pick up spaceship parts, pizza, and of course, cats. Alf would also later be seen in a handful of DOS edutainment games like Add and Subtract with Alf, Alf's Thinking Skills, Alf's World of Words, Alf's US Geography, and Alf's Party Kit. Man, my next birthday is gonna be lit. Time to dig out that dot matrix printer. And to wrap things up here, special thanks to everyone supporting on Patreon and on Twitch, with Alf being the winner of the monthly game poll. And as usual, I had a great time streaming this one and putting this video piece together. And we'll close out with words of wisdom from the Alfer himself. Life's like a sewer. You take what you can get. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time. Today we're plummeting into the surreal world of MDK, a wild and weird third-person action game originating from some of the creators of the Earthworm Jim series, along with a sequel that was somehow drenched in even more absurdity. So let's make deep critique and dive in. The Shiny Entertainment team, fresh off of their work on Earthworm Jim 1 and 2, and also notably fresh off of being bought out by Interplay, would follow up their success by developing their first game in 3D and first game for PC with MDK, released in 1997 and eventually ported to the Mac and PS1 that same year. One of the main designers, Nick Bruti, has said publicly it was created in response to years of working on much safer, family-friendly material previously, as he had not only worked on the Earthworm Jim series, but also titles like Aladdin and The Jungle Book on the Sega Genesis. So MDK, unofficially standing for Murder, Death, Kill, would take a somewhat sharper edge, but still retaining some silliness, with the story of a reluctant janitor, Kurt Hectic, embarking on Mission Deliver Kindness, which is basically tasking him to destroy all of the aliens who have invaded Earth, stripping it of resources using giant mine crawlers, and led by the dastardly Gunter Glut. Kurt would have the support of Dr. Fluke Hawkins aboard the spaceship Jim Dandy, who has also created a cyborg dog with 2 legs and 4 arms named Bones, and also Max, and along with Kurt's unique skin-tight coil suit complete with a parachute thing, and let's not forget an arm-mounted chain gun which doubles as a super zoomy sniper rifle if reattached to Kurt's head. The dock will also send down various wacky power-ups during your quest, including punching balloon decoys, grenades, thumping hammers, and the world's smallest nukes, which are actually just glorified keycards, usually needed to bypass certain doorways. As you can probably see by now, MDK is a third-person action game with an emphasis on running and gunning, but a few other funky things going on as well. Each level starts off with a brief skydiving sequence as you disembark from the Jim Dandy down to the next mine crawler, dodging projectiles while also trying to grab random power-ups on the way down. Once you land, you will be in more familiar third-person shooter platformer territory, with fast and smooth movement, the ability to strafe, and while you can look up and down, your machine gun will generally do the aiming for you automatically. You can also jump, grab ledges, and utilize your coil suit's parachute to float around a little bit. The platforming is admittedly a little bit jank sometimes, with unclear collisions and hitboxes for sticking the landings and grabbing ledges, but those moments are few and far between and not really focused on very much. And one of the more innovative and technically impressive mechanics at the time of this game was Kurt's sniper mode, which has an adjustable 100 times magnification, even giving you a small camera view of your bullet as it flies to its destination, hopefully into an alien's brain. There are a handful of special sniper power-ups you can acquire as well, some of which needed for light puzzle-solving moments, such as lobbing mortar shots into tubes to take out these foes behind protective glass. Overall, this mode is executed well, adds a refreshing dimension to the gameplay, and provides some alternative tactics to the usual guns a-blazing approach. Not that there's anything wrong with that approach, the hectic moments of MDK are a blast, your perspective tilting and swerving with your speed, and a lot of development work was put into the software maintaining a solid 30 frames per second without requiring a GPU. The minimal art style with sharp angled lines and some dark areas with very little detail at all are very deliberately crafted with respect to machine performance, and still give this game a very distinct and memorable look without resorting to fog. It's no wonder this game became a benchmark for testing video cards back in the day, and even eventually became pre-installed on some first-generation iMac machines. I should say the PS1 version shown here also runs very smoothly and looks great, and has the benefit of more available colors on screen and some extra lighting effects, while compressing down some of the animations. I also prefer the controls on this version, but mouse and keyboard enthusiasts may want to stick to the PC one, and also be able to tweak the graphics to their liking. In total, there are 6 levels, each split up into several rooms or large arena-type areas, and connected by tunnels which help act as loading zones. And eventually there's some kind of boss battle which tends to either be straight-up action-focused, or sometimes more puzzly or sniper-focused. So things overall do feel a bit on the short side, and it's not super difficult either, at least on normal mode. But some mild replayability is there if you wanted to try hard mode, or also completing the levels fast enough to actually save the city's residents of that particular area. But despite the short length, the game is just a ton of fun to blast through, with a unique mix of gameplay, hilarious absurdity, and some striking environments. It was a resounding success at the time, both critically and commercially, and the publishers Interplay were foaming at the mouth to immediately start work on a sequel. The designer Nick Brutti didn't want a repeat of getting burned out on Earthworm Jim, and had also just started work on a new game for his own development studio called Giants Citizen Kabuto, so Interplay ultimately decided to hand off MDK2 development duties to a fairly new little company called BioWare. At the time BioWare was chosen for developing this sequel, they were wrapping up their work on the first Baldur's Gate game, which would be a huge success and a big breakthrough for the studio. MDK2 wouldn't be their first action game, as their first game ever was Shattered Steel, a legally distinct MechWarrior sim, but MDK2 would be their first time developing for consoles. The game would be released for the Dreamcast in the spring of 2000, with a PC version to soon follow along, with a slightly updated PS2 port in 2001 titled MDK2 Armageddon, the version I played to get the footage you're seeing here. Ten years later, MDK2 would also get a port to Nintendo's WiiWare service, along with a remastered version called MDK2 HD for the PC. But we'll get into all the version differences later. Taking place directly after the events of the first game, Kurt, Max, and Doc's celebration would be cut short as they discover one more minecrawler headed towards Edmonton, Canada, and the battle for Earth's safety would be far from over as Kurt gets abducted at the end of the first stage by Schwang Schwing, a big alien dude. From here we would get introduced to playing as the other characters, as each of the game's 10 levels essentially alternate play between the 3 of them, each with their own very unique playstyles and mechanics, and varied level designs geared accordingly. Kurt's gameplay would be pretty faithful to the original, with fast-paced running and gunning interspersed with sniper puzzles and platforming. Max, the cigar-smoking cyborg dog, would be more focused on firepower, with the ability to equip any combination of 4 guns in his available hands, with your loadout becoming a continuously evolving mix of Gatling guns, Uzis, shotguns, and lasers. Oh, and he has a jetpack sometimes, with some sections of levels focusing on fuel management. Last and probably least, you will also need to play as Dr. Hawkins, with his stages having more of an adventure game feel, tracking down necessary items to progress to new areas, combine items into haphazard weaponry like the atomic toaster, but mostly you'll be bumbling around falling off of things with the most limited jumping and movement abilities of the 3. So the 3 different characters do certainly add variety to the game, in a similar way that the sniper puzzles and minigame elements in MDK1 did, but here it's a bit more structured. Other than the game's final area, you are locked into that specific character for that stage. The downside being that if you're not a big fan of a certain character's controls or style, you're still just gonna have to deal with it for at least 3 levels of the game's entirety. So it kind of addresses the issue of the first game being pretty short, but you're not necessarily getting more of the frantic Kurt-style gameplay here. The game definitely does retain the surreal mix of absurdist humor along with striking visuals. Fully voiced cutscenes give the 3 characters a bit more depth and add a nice touch of vintage sci-fi comic book pulpiness to everything.
Let's put this sissy down. Heal Max.
Visually, it goes further beyond the minimal, sharp angled look and adds a lot more intricate textures to the environments. And some of the stages feel absolutely huge in scope and make the overall universe feel more alive. One area that saw a big change from the original is in the game's difficulty, although this would be somewhat addressed in the various versions of the game. The Dreamcast version probably being the hardest, as the PC and PS2 reworked versions would add various difficulty modes to pick from, and the PS2 version would even add various visual cues to some of the puzzles, making it more obvious of what you need to do next. But even still, there are some really tough moments that will likely lead to some frustration, especially in some of the platforming bits. Falling off of stuff as Hawkins over and over again really slowed the pace of the game for me at times. And don't get me started on the final boss fight, which had a neat concept but ultimately became one of the most annoying things I've had to deal with in a video game in a long time. The reworked difficulty options and tweaks would be the main differences between the first 3 versions of MDK2, aside from differences in controls and mild graphical differences between platforms. And the PS2 version is generally considered to be the definitive version of the original game and probably uses the controller of choice. MDK2 on the Wii was an interesting occurrence though, with an all-new control scheme utilizing the Wiimote and nunchuck, but it does have some downgrades in graphics and sound in order to compress the file size small enough for being downloadable on the WiiWare service. MDK2 HD, which is still available to purchase today on Steam and GOG, keeps all the content intact from the PS2 version, but completely overhauls the 3D models, lighting, textures, and remasters the soundtrack. Keep in mind this remake is still from 2011, so you might run into some speed bumps getting it running on modern machines. Overall, if you like the first MDK, I would say with trepidation to give the sequel a try, but I'm personally feeling pretty split on my feelings on it. The multiple character thing does what it set out to do and adds variety to the game, but for me it felt like it added a lot of annoying things, and I would have probably preferred either playing as Kurt the entire time, or maybe just the ability to change characters at will whenever the need arises, instead of locking you into a long level with a single one. I played this on normal difficulty, and while the challenge felt satisfying at times, some moments definitely ended up being completely brutal. I shudder to think of what Jinkies mode must be like. Complaints aside, I can't deny the game's creativity, and it's really a valiant effort to follow up on the original. But I think I prefer MDK1, with its more straightforward approach and unique aesthetic. It's really too bad we never got an MDK3, despite Interplay announcing plans for one in 2007. But if you're really craving more MDK-like action, you might be well served to check out Giant Citizen Kabuto from the same folks who made the first game, with some similarities in its third-person shooting action and sense of humor, along with some real-time strategy bits thrown in the mix. As always, thanks for watching, and special thanks to the folks supporting on Patreon and Twitch who picked MDK in the supporter poll for this month. And if you like run and guns, definitely check out the full retrospective of the Contra series I just finished recently. And we'll catch you next time.
Oh, thanks, mister.
And today we've got a random showdown between 2 somewhat obscure Japanese exclusive giant monster kaiju video games. It's King Kong 2 versus Gamera 2000. These are a bit weird to compare, but they were both picked this month as part of a tying vote in my monthly poll for Patreon and Twitch supporters, so we might as well make them battle it out in review form. First up, we'll look at King Kong 2 Ikari no Megaton Punch for the Famicom. Published and developed by Konami and released in 1986, loosely based on the movie King Kong Lives, which came out that same year. While the movie was a box office flop that helped drive Dino De Laurentiis' production company into bankruptcy, and has generally been critically panned, I'd say it's still a pretty fun flick to check out sometime. A classic tale of a giant monkey in a coma who needs a blood transfusion and heart transplant, and miraculously a giant lady Kong is found, which naturally drives Kong into an apeshit frenzy of horniness and havoc ensues. While Japan would actually get 2 games based on this movie, one being an action RPG on the MSX, having you control the Indiana Jones-like Mitchell character. The Famicom version we're looking at today would put you in control of the big guy himself, fresh off of his surgery and on a mission to release Lady Kong from captivity. To do this, you'll need to find 8 different keys, each protected by a boss monster, all spread out across 8 different worlds, along with a final area where Lady Kong is imprisoned. Luckily, all of these worlds are interconnected by bewildering amounts of secret doorways that warp you around without much rhyme or reason. But before we get deeper into that, the real attraction here is playing as King Kong, and he actually controls really well and even has an immensely satisfying screen shake after landing your jumps. The game is always in this top-down action Zelda-like perspective, and you can either punch enemies and environmental objects, or also throw a limited supply of boulders. Enemies are pretty generous with dropping health or boulder ammo, so restocking isn't too hard on the less hectic screens. In your travels, you can also get potions that increase your speed, artificial heart upgrades to increase your maximum health, rock sacks to increase your maximum rock ammo, upgrades to your rock attack power, and even little Konami logos that summon Konami Man, who will give you a full health refill if you can grab him. While the action is pretty straightforward, we should get back to the whole doorway thing, as you need to continuously search for these secret doors, usually hidden under destructible objects like trees, buildings, and other structures, and essentially you'll just need to experiment and check through all of them to figure out where you'll get warped to, or sometimes very useful item upgrades hide within. Or most importantly, you'll find boss rooms where you'll battle it out to obtain one of the 8 required keys. When playing for the first time, this can get a bit confusing, so it might be worth making a map or at least taking some notes to better navigate the world. And while the game isn't overly long, there are no saves or continues, so you'll need to do everything in one shot, which makes those additional health and rock upgrades pretty crucial to track down. Technically, you could beat this game in just 3 minutes, if you don't mind damage boosting yourself through the doorway leading to the final boss fight. Overall, after getting more acclimated to the whole door warping situation, I actually had a ton of fun with this game. The graphics and music are pretty great and very in line with Konami's typical quality of the era, and Kong's controls are very satisfying, especially after getting a few speed potions, with plenty of mid-air movement control and tons of stuff to smash up in a wide range of locales. It's a bit lacking in the challenge department, with generally simple bosses and a pretty underwhelming final boss room, but the exploration aspect will probably keep you busy enough for a nice and destructive afternoon, and the ending is legit adorable. It's still interesting to me that this one never came out stateside, but maybe since the movie bombed so badly in the US, Konami might have decided it was a financial risk at that point. But either way, I definitely recommend giving this one a go.
Is that what we call Gamera, Lieutenant?
That's right.
Now let's flash forward 20 years later to Gamera 2000, released in 1997 on the PS1. While this one wasn't directly based on any specific movie, it was made during a resurgence of Gamera films in the mid-90s, and again this would be another game stuck only in Japan. Although honestly, this one is very import-friendly, without any critical text in Japanese, and even the FMV cutscenes are acted out in English. Which right off the bat, I gotta say, the FMV here is some grade A cheese. and adds a lot of fun B-movie flavor to the experience. The actual gameplay is more akin to something like Panzer Dragoon, a rail shooter where you typically control a ship piloted by members of the United Nations Science Academy, while Gamera helps. Yeah, unfortunately, you don't get to play as Gamera directly, with the exception of family mode co-op play. But usually, you'll essentially be blasting away enemies and can also lock in on them and trigger Gamera to shoot off volleys of homing fireballs. And you'll certainly be keeping busy with unleashing his firepower on the slew of invading Biomecha and Mutant Gauss coming at you from all directions. And you'll also need to occasionally change your view angle to deal with this accordingly. The game has 8 levels total and a variety of environments and occasionally a change of vehicle, along with plenty of cutscene interludes to advance a generic action-focused storyline and a considerable challenge ramp-up as the game progresses. You do have some slight maneuverability for dodging some things, but I'd say the emphasis here is instead placed on dispatching enemies quickly or shooting down their incoming projectiles. And while the movement can feel somewhat limited, at least everything else is very responsive and generally very satisfying to play. There are also 3 different difficulty modes to give a nice range of gameplay experiences, so there are means to extend this rather short game into multiple playthroughs. This one's a bit standard for this genre, and it doesn't bring anything very innovative to the table, but perhaps more importantly, it's just plain fun. The graphics are some great low poly goodness, with plenty of varied textures, lots of cool monsters and giant robots to deal with, and a pulsing electronic soundtrack that's certainly worth listening to outside of the game as well. And of course, the previously mentioned cutscenes are hilarious if you're into that sort of thing. Not unlike King Kong 2, this is another fun afternoon romp, and yet another game that unfortunately never got a Western release, despite THQ expressing some interest in doing so at the time, but plans never materialized. While these 2 games were released over 20 years apart, and they're quite different in their genre, and not even on the same platform, I'm still afraid they must battle it out for supreme kaiju dominance anyway. It's tough. I really genuinely enjoyed both of these quite a lot, and I would easily recommend either one. But if the fate of the planet depended on it, and I were forced to choose one, I might have to go with Kong. The exploration side of the game tips the scales ever so slightly for me on this one, along with the very short speedrun possibility, which has me considering picking it back up again sometime in the future. Special thanks once more to those that voted in the monthly poll, even if you didn't vote for the Data East game, and we'll catch you next time.